Chapter 10, Using Language Well. So in this chapter, we're going to talk about language. I want you to think about the things we've talked about so far. We've talked about organization. We've talked about the fact that your speech needs to be in an organized format and it needs to flow sensibly so that your audience can easily follow you. We've talked about delivery. We've talked about posture and gestures and volume and pitch and tone of voice and vocal variety. And so in this chapter, we're going to talk about language. We're going to talk about how you can use your language to be most effective when you're giving a presentation in front of your audience. So language is one of the most influential and powerful aspects of our daily lives, and yet very few of us pay attention to it in our interpersonal and public communication styles. Language constructs reflects and maintains our social realities, or what we believe to be truth, with regard to the world around us. So constructing clear and vivid messages. So one thing that we can do when we're delivering messages is to avoid abstract language. So think about the word abstract, and we know that like an abstract painting is something that you look at and it's like, I don't really know what that is. I'm not sure what that's supposed to be. It's not clear cut. It's not concrete. And so when we communicate in front of an audience, we want to make sure that we're avoiding abstract language, that the language we use is clear and concrete. The more precise we are, the less likely our audience is to misinterpret our message, and the less likely we are to cause miscommunication issues. So let's think about the words that we use and to make sure they're not up for interpretation. So avoid language that obstructs communication. Avoid jargon, specialized language of a group or profession. So think about this. If you're talking to an audience about a topic that you're super knowledgeable about, it's your thing, it's the thing you're best at, you know the most about it, and you're talking to an audience about that, and you use all these technical terms, then the audience isn't going to know what you're discussing. At Avera College, where I teach also part-time in Corsicana in Texas, they have a John Deere program, and I teach a lot of students that are in the John Deere program. They're going through a program to learn how to fix, repair, build John Deere tractors. In that, I get a lot of students that give speeches about that, and there are so many things that go into what they do in that program that I have no idea about. And there are times that I'll hear a speech about it and I'll think, man, they really kind of broke down that topic that's a little bit complicated, and I can understand it where I didn't think I could before. And then other times I'll hear a speech and I'm even more confused about what that they do, because they use terms that I'm not familiar with. They use technical jargon that is very appropriate to their program, and it's appropriate for what they're specializing in, but it's not appropriate for those of us that are unfamiliar. So also avoid slang. Slang is language that some people might understand but is not considered acceptable in formal or polite conversation. And also know that slang doesn't necessarily translate across age groups. So you may use slang, and not only is it informal, but it's also not necessarily easy to interpret by everyone. So using stylized language. Metaphors are comparisons made by speaking of one thing in terms of another. The power of a metaphor is in its ability to create an image that is linked to an emotion in the mind of the audience. So you can think back to middle school English class where you learned about metaphors and similes, and we know that metaphors compare things directly, and it creates an image that's linked to an emotion. Think about Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. He uses the metaphor of checking account to make his point throughout that. Similes are similar to metaphors in how they function, but similes compare them using like or as. In this same I Have a Dream speech, Dr. King also makes use of similes, which also compares two things, but do so using like or as. Similes help make your message clear by using ideas that are more concrete for your audience to understand. Alliteration is the repetition of the initial sounds of words. Look for alternative words to use that follow alliteration in your speech. You might consider doing this, especially when it comes to the points that you would like your audience to remember. So alliteration is the repetition of the initial sounds of words. Antithesis allows you to use contrasting statements in order to make a rhetorical point. Usually two competing ideas in one statement make an argument in order to draw the listener's attention. So antithesis pits opposing things together. Parallel structure, the balance of two or more similar phrases or clauses, and parallel wording is the balance of two or more similar words. So parallel structure allows your audience to have similar phrasing. They hear you say things in a similar way that helps reinforce memory. And use language that personalizes your topic, such as us, you, and we. The importance of ethical and accurate language. Number one, we think about our words and we choose our words wisely. It's important to choose the words that we say very carefully. We have one opportunity to get our message across and to get our message across accurately. Choose words that provide clarity. Again, avoid abstract language. Make sure your language is very clear and concrete. Choose vivid language. Paint pictures for your audience. Help them see what it is that you're trying to tell them. Make sure that your language is something that they have an easy, very clear, easy, simple understanding of what it is that you're trying to avoid. Avoid bias. Do not unfairly label one thing or another based on personal bias. Communicate reality to the very best of your ability and avoid sexist language. So avoiding language pitfalls. Refrain from using profanity. This doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen, especially when a student messes up. And if profanity is part of their everyday vocabulary, then when something bad happens, it slips out. And so that's sometimes when it happens. But try to avoid profanity. Be careful about exaggeration. Be careful about with words like always and never. So especially like when you're giving a persuasive speech and you're trying to pull the audience over to your side, be careful to say this always happens, or this never happens, or this person never does this. Avoid that language. Use powerful language. Avoid hedges. I thought we should. I sort of think. Maybe we should. Avoid tag questions, quick questions at the end of a sentence that always communicates uncertainty. So if sometimes I feel this way if a speaker is not very sure about what they're saying, that their message comes across more like a question rather than a statement. Consider qualifiers. Words like around or about make your sentences less definitive. Make sure your grammar is correct. Basic errors occurs when we make simple mistakes in grammar, and sometimes, kind of like profanity, if in our daily language we allow ourselves to make grammatical errors and don't correct them, then sometimes that happens pretty easily when we're giving a speech. So be very careful about that. Be careful with your pronunciations. It's important to practice words, practice pronouncing words you don't know, write out how you think a word should be spelled for how it sounds if you're unsure, and that'll help you say it correctly when you give the speech. There's some words you need to slow down quite a bit. In the process of these lessons, I realized desensitization is a word I need to slow down to get it accurately. So sometimes you may want to make yourself notes like, this is how I think this word should be spelled. If it's spelled this way, then I can say it correctly. Make those notes on your outline. Make a note to say slow down when you say this, because there's often times when we say things in our head, we know how to say them. But for some reason, getting it from our brain out our mouth, it doesn't work quite the same. So we need to be aware of that. Regionalism, customary words or phrases used in different geographic regions, and colloquialisms is very similar. It's used in informal speech, but not typically used in formal speech. So this is something that I've never had to deal with that much with my class, but being from Texas, and you guys, most of you are not, that's something that I have to be very careful of the things that I say. We say a lot of words in Texas. We've just kind of developed our own language that doesn't make sense to anyone else. So when I'm doing these lectures, I have I try to slow down. I'm really working on my accent, but I'm also, you may not notice that, but I am. But I also am really trying to work on making sure that I don't throw in language that would not be familiar to you. So we do the same thing when we're giving a speech, is that we be aware, we are aware of things that we say that's common in our state, our community, our region, but may not be so common outside of that. Avoid cliches, overused language, expressions that are overused. They've kind of lost their power because people use them too much. And they typically say, I know this is cliche, but if you know it's cliche, typically we should avoid that. And language central to pop culture, such as slang, profanity, and stemming from pop culture, we should avoid that. So as you're developing your speeches, like we've talked about several times before, remember that we're writing for the ear, so we want to keep things simple, but we also want to make sure things are very clear, they're vivid, they're concrete for the audience. And when we choose our words very carefully, then we make it easier for the audience to understand what it is that we're saying, and our message definitely gets delivered much easier and smoother.